This recording is brought to you by the Berkeley Fiction Review.
Today, we are delighted to have our esteemed guest, Professor Hollis, who is a professor at the UC Berkeley Fall Program, as well as the author of the book, Leslie Stevens, as Mountaineer, and articles on authors such as Virginia Woolf and Zhou. Welcome, Professor Hollis.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Misha. I'm delighted to be here with you.
And we as well are so happy to have you here on the podcast today. A little fun fact for the audience at home. I was very fortunate enough to be in Professor Hollis's class my very first semester here at UC Berkeley. And in this course on dystopian novels, I was able to learn so much about being able to break down narratives and not just learn, in her own words, to survive in the apocalypse, but thrive and push forward. And the things I learned in this course were able to be applied even in the real world today. As we see such a descent in the world going into such chaos, sometimes it feels hard to figure out where to go next. And in this class, I was able to draw these parallels from these novels that we were able to read, apply them to the real world and say, hey, well, we might not be dealing with crazy people throwing fire bombs all over us, but
We might be.
you never know.
So to start off, we'd like to hear about what your first encounter with literature was. What did you study in college?
Well, my first encounter with literature would have been before I could read. My parents were both English major English instructors. They both taught composition, which is why I love it so much. But I think I colored all over. My dad was a self-aggrandizing poet. So there was all these volumes of Ezra Pound and W.B. Yeats, and I think I scribbled all over them with crayons, or crayons, as people say, which is, I think, a proper response to poets like that. I love Yeats, but not Pound. But we're already in it now. All right, what did I study in college? I was a film and English major, and as we were talking about earlier, I kind of sucked at film production. I got my only B in college was in video production because I was just bad with the cameras and the lighting, though I was pretty good at editing. Anyway, that turned me to a cinema studies major. This was at NYU, where you can get a BFA and never take math or science or anything useful. So all I did in college was take film classes and take English classes. And I'm not recommending that as a pragmatic course, but it was really, really fun. So I'm glad you're both English majors. My mother particularly taught composition for college students for like 30 plus years. And then she also was the director of a continuing education program at a little college called Cabrini outside of Philadelphia. And so I think idolized, this is weird, I idolized how she would grade papers on a Saturday afternoon while watching football. And so this is the 70s, and people would turn in their English papers typed out on actual typing paper, and then you would put a plastic binder around it, like a clear plastic binder with a colorful clip. And for some reason that sounded like the height of adult maturity to me, that you'd sit in your chair on a Saturday afternoon grading papers and watching football. And now that I've been grading papers for 30 years, I'd like to say that it's not that glamorous.
So going off from film, could we talk a little bit about your book on Leslie Stevens? Leslie Stevens is Mountaineer, which was published by Cecil Wolf Publishers in 2010. Virginia Woolf is widely studied in our English department. I noticed there was like a 190 at one point, a research seminar on Virginia Woolf. But could you tell us about what made you interested in Leslie Stevens, her father?
Absolutely. First off, if anyone gets a chance to take a Woolf class with Elizabeth Abel, Professor Elizabeth Abel, please do so. She was my dissertation director here because I got my PhD here in the English department, and she's amazing. A. And then B, so Woolf was part of my dissertation. I go to the Virginia Woolf Conference every year. And as an aside, the Woolf Conference is really open to what Virginia Woolf would call common readers. So the idea is we welcome undergrads. We welcome high school students. So if you ever want to go to your first kind of academic conference, contact me, and I'll help you get through the things. Next year it's going to be in Sussex, England, which might be a bit of a leap. But it's cool because Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell both had country houses, if you will, in the Sussex countryside. And Vanessa Bell was a painter, and so she had a farmhouse called Charleston where all these members of the Bloomsbury group would hang out and like paint and write. And Virginia Woolf's father, I was really interested. Leslie Stephen is Virginia Woolf's father. And if you start reading Woolf biographies, he's often given a very bad rap. He had a difficult personality, but he's also the person who encouraged Virginia Woolf to read any book she wanted to read out of his library. He really encouraged her autodidactic education. She never had formal schooling, but just through her father and through her brothers, she absorbed a lot of literature. Her father was also a really famous mountaineer. And so if you climb mountains in the Swiss Alps, if you look at mountaineering guidebooks, you'll see that he's got credit for making first ascents on 15 of the 40 huge peaks in the European Alps. Mm-hmm. So he's like, in mountaineering history, he's a big deal. But in Woolf studies, he's often like, oh, that father who was moody and gloomy and, all that. So I was like, I want to bring these two things together. I was also climbing at the time. So then you're like, well, I'm doing some rock climbing. I think I'll write about climbing. Oh, look, here's Virginia Woolf's father. So that was that. I had a couple of trips to the Alps where I was trying to, basically, I don't climb at his level, but I did try to do some of the peaks that he had done. I think his most incredible first ascent is this mountain called the Schreckhorn. It's super Schreckhorn, Terror Peak. No, the Eiger, I think Schreckhorn is Terror Peak. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I made 2 attempts on it. It defeated me. But it was really great because Thomas Hardy wrote a poem about Leslie Stephen. So Thomas Hardy, the novelist and poet, and he wrote a poem called The Schreckhorn, and it's this amazing poem where he's comparing Leslie Stephen, gaunt and difficult, to the actual peak, which in fact is gaunt and difficult. And so for me, I'm a very, I think, experiential person. So I felt like in order to write about Leslie Stephen climbing, I needed to follow in his footsteps and see with my eyes and feel with my body what he encountered, while he was climbing. So that was what drew me to that project.
That's really interesting. I think when it was like preparing for this interview, I kind of, the story I had collected in my mind was you had first researched Leslie Stephen and then you were following in his footsteps. But what I'm hearing now is it evolved out of your own interest for rock climbing, which you came to kind of pursue further as you learned more about Leslie Stephen. I also read you have a blog, Downhill All the Way, and you write about how the process was of climbing the mountain. But when I was reading it, it almost came across as a story in itself, in the way that it was written. And I was just wondering what kind of led you to write it in that style as opposed to a more diary-esque, this is when we got up, this is what we did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Misha, for that question, because I'm still trying to work through that project. I love heights. I mean, I was the kind of kid that climbed trees. So going to Alex is like, no. I love climbing. So I did my first mountain climbing Mount Rainier in 2004. And I was like, got to change my life. Got to keep doing this. This is the best thing ever. And what I realized is that it was similar for Leslie Stephen as it was for me. I think that if you suffer from just garden variety mental health stuff, anxiety, depression, when you start climbing, it all goes away because you have to focus. It's so difficult. And, it's cold, it's hot, you're thirsty. It's where's my hand going to go? Where's my foot going to go? All that mind chatter that kind of makes us miserable. You can't think about that. You can only focus on the very present moment. And I think that was my sort of insight into Leslie Stephen's character. Even he climbed so often because it was good for his mental health. And similarly, Virginia Woolf, she was a walker her whole life. She would, and walking it's not just good for, your health, but it's also how she came up with To the Lighthouse, the plot of To the Lighthouse, just walking around Tavistock Square in London where she lived. And suddenly she's walking, she describes walking, and then it was like the whole plot just went into her mind. And so I was really fascinated by that connection between bodily movement and thinking. And there's a lot of great books out there on walking and thinking. A lot of great writers
Right.
have been inveterate walkers. At the time, I thought, well, what if I do a memoir where I'm climbing in Leslie Stevens' footsteps, and it's a way of repairing and healing my mental health challenges, and it's relevant for him and for Virginia Woolf. And so there's a lot of these kind of creative nonfiction approaches these days where someone will be like, I'm reading Virginia Woolf and I realized I need a divorce because I need a room of my own, or something like that.
Right.
Like a lot of times, I think in the 21st century, I read a lot of memoir, and a lot of people will write a memoir that's based on their reading of an author who lived, say, 100 years ago, whether it's, George Eliot or Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf. And that's where I got a little stymied, because I was just like, all right, how do I make it reflect my own thinking and my own creativity? And I struggle with writing a lot. I mean, the struggles that you have writing a paper now are common to all writers, right? And maybe that's the struggle to find your voice, or the struggle to believe in your voice, or the struggle to believe that you're not an idiot, or that anyone would ever want to read your work. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
And I think it's undergraduates struggle with that, but honestly, I think famous prize-winning authors, maybe they struggle with it too. All I know is I struggle with it, and I'm neither famous nor prize-winning.
A lot of papers I've kind of had difficulty with writing it. It's been this kind of fear that what you mentioned, that fear about, is what I'm saying smart? Particularly, does this argument make sense, and would the author believe in that's what I was doing? I was writing an essay on Blade Runner of all things, and it was kind of over analyzing and looking at every single moment. But then insight I got into that was, you don't need to look at exactly what the filmmaker, what the author is arguing at, what the text itself or the film could be saying and what messages it does bring, which I'm learning now is almost a separate entity from the author itself.
Yeah, I would say that U.S. English departments are founded on what they would call the intentional fallacy. And so this is out of New Criticism in the 1940s. And the idea is that it doesn't matter what the author intended. The poem or the work of art or Blade Runner is its own text. And there's a freedom to that, because then I would say that what's interesting about your encounter with Blade Runner is what you get out of it. Doesn't matter what Ridley Scott meant.
Right.
It's what you're getting out of it. And I say that in English 1B too, because it's, if you're writing on Turn of the Screw by Henry James or something like that, there's been thousands and thousands and thousands of boring essays, and not boring, but thousands of student essays on this. What's creative and interesting is you, the writer, you, the English 1B student. So what's your perspective on it? And that's where I kind of quarrel with the intentional fallacy, because I know we're sort of jumping into pedagogy, but I do encourage students on some of the papers to write in the first person if that's comfortable for them. And I want people to check in with their own experiences, their own family history, cultural history, because I think the experiences that you bring to the text, from those experiences, you make the text open up. So it's a dialogue between your particular set of circumstances and Blade Runner.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how, especially with some texts that are really hard. You mentioned Henry James, and what came to mind was a story he wrote called Figure in the Carpet, which these stories just refuse interpretation. And so how do you come up with an argument that feels original? It's like you pull on your own experience. I mean, I can't say that's why those stories were written for that intention, but I feel like when you go into an English class, that's how you come to analyze those stories.
Absolutely. And I think as undergraduate English classes in particular, it's just about close reading the text for the most part, rather than, a detailed analysis of authorial biography or literary history, even though what I love the most is biography and history. So I'm not like a super theoretical person. Like, you're going to have super theoretical, philosophical English professors out there. And they're on a whole different level from me. That's why I like to hang out teaching comp, because I'm really thinking about writing and making writing and thought accessible to a broad audience. And that's why the Virginia Woolf community is a great space for people, because Woolf really believed in the common reader. So not just the academic or the scholarly reader, but that thinking in terms of literature or film, that should be available for everyone, right? And
Right.
so I'm really interested in helping people write accessibly. Because,
Yeah.
if you don't go to grad school, you'll go on, you'll have some kind of job, and your ability to communicate and think clearly is how you're going to get that job.
Right. And so that's when those kind of skills come in handy. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but no one's going to hire you for your ability to read novels and watch movies all day. Doesn't this suck?
yeah,
does.
I've been the farther I've been getting into the major, it's the sad truth.
It is the
It's-
sad
yeah.
truth, but that's what a day job is about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if you want to write, if you want to be an artist, if you want to be a musician, do it. Don't ever give up. Pick it up at any point in your life. But, the reality is day job.
Yep, yep.
day job.
My dream for a while has been to be a novelist, and so day job, it's like, what is going to be that? Because you get ideas of writers just doing it, but then there's that voice in my head's like, oh, let's say I write a novel, I publish it, then what? Because that in itself, publishing being how it is very difficult, and so
Trollope. The Victorian novelist Trollope always had a day job, I think at the post office, and he would get up and write from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. Toni Morrison worked as a editor and a publisher. Toni Morrison, America's best novelist. I'll fight that. I'll die on that hill. But she had a day job. She worked, and I think what you do is you figure out where are those hours that you can reclaim for writing. And
Right.
for some people, it is 5 a.m. to 6 a.m., 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. I think sometimes it doesn't need to be much longer than 2 hours if you do it consistently. And for other people, it might be late at night when things are quiet. But it's often, I think, in those small hours when the world is a little less demanding on you and your creative imagination can take shape.
Right. Yeah.
A little bit more. Also, you can write weird little tricks I have, write down your dreams. Because the more you write down your dreams, then the more you remember them. And sometimes your dreams, that's your unconscious mind kind of filtering through material. Sometimes you get the germ of an idea in a dream.
That's really interesting. I've never tried actually using the dream itself to kind of spur a story on. Have you ever kind of dabbled in creative writing? Was that a field is this something you're kind of exploring?
Apparently I suck at fiction, but I do a lot of memoir. I've done a lot of memoir writing, and the other thing is I've kept a diary pretty rigorously since I was my first year of college. Actually, I kept it earlier, but my mother, darn her, threw all my early productions out.
Oh.
Parents, never throw out your children's early productions. Keep those notebooks. But I tell everyone in English 1B to keep a diary. Not just, something like a blog or whatnot,
Right.
but because it's so fun when you're 20 years from now, and then you read what you were writing at age 20 and, who you loved and who you hated and what was happening and your concerns. And it's amazing. And also, I just think keeping a diary is a great way of doing writing every day, even if things suck.
Right. Yeah.
Or, you're like,
Staying
I can't
consistent.
write my novel. I've got to work this stupid job and take this stupid exam. But if you write in your diary, I got to take this stupid exam. It's at least you're writing. I think that part of it's just exercising the writing muscle as often as possible. I mean, Virginia Woolf kept a diary her whole life. Right now, I'm reading letters that Virginia Woolf, before she was Virginia Woolf, wrote. She's 20 years old, and she's writing to this older woman, Violet Dickinson, and she has such a crush on Violet. And these letters are kooky. I mean, she's 20 years old, and she's like flirtatious as all heck. And then later in life, she's a famous novelist, and like, oh, don't want to talk about that chapter. But I actually think there's some real energy to the writing you put out between 18 and 21. Do you know what I mean? Like your teenage stuff. It's so impassioned and passionate. And I think that energy you kind of lose the older you get. So there's a comedy show, by the way, called Get Mortified that performs around here, and I've been in it. And it's so it's adults read their teenage and childhood writings out loud in a bar, like for comic effect. And so I read all these poems I wrote as an 18-year-old, and they're just disastrous. I mean, now you'd call them like what is it? Heteropessimism. That's it. They're heteropessimists to the nth degree, but it's 1985 when I'm writing them, and it's so fun performing and Get Mortified. And so you should check it out. They have performances once a month in the East Bay and San Francisco, and it's sort of a way that actors and comics can use their childhood materials, but also it can be really moving. And a lot of times you'll get stories of people, where, I don't know, they don't know they're gay yet, but, their auntie next door is cultivating them by sharing her, soap operas with them or something like that. Like, just really, it's a nice way of reflecting on your juvenilia, I think is the word. So I'm a big fan of juvenilia, which is probably why I hang out in English 1B all the time.
And we're all lucky to have you there.
But yeah, the writing I do now would be boring in comparison with the writing I did when I was 18.
Is it still kind of along the line of kind of a memoir, creative nonfiction?
You know what? I sort of backtracked. I've been doing more academic writing recently. Like right now I'm writing a chapter on Virginia Woolf and biography, and how she talks about biography, biographical sketches she wrote. You can think of her novel Orlando as an extended satire on biography. So I'm kind of doing more academic writing now, but around the time I was mountain climbing, that's when I was doing a lot of memoir writing. And memoir writing can be as creative as fiction, because you want to use, or I think, I wanted to use the structure of like narrative fiction, like you want to have scenes and characters and dialogue and structure the memoir as though it were a short story or a novel or something like that.
Right. Shifting gears a little, I wanted to talk to you about your time at the Emma Goldman Papers Project. For our listeners who don't know, Emma Goldman was a Russian Jewish immigrant to America who was eventually deported to Russia for protesting against conscription during World War I. She was a feminist and an advocate for workers' rights and free speech. How did you come to work at the Emma Goldman
And birth
Papers
control.
Project? Birth control.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Berkeley-based historian named Candace Falk, who in 1984 wrote a biography. Oh, now I can't remember. It was Love, Anarchy, and Emma Goldman. And I think I stumbled across that biography in high school. And I was like, this is it. And so I started signing all my teenage letters, love, peace, love, anarchy, bunnies. So Candace has run here in Berkeley the Emma Goldman Papers Project, and that's a documentary history project. And so what it's done is it's covered Emma Goldman's American years, basically from 1890 to 1919, when she was deported with a lot of other left-wing labor activists, many Russian Jewish people, because the nascent FBI was trying to round up the radicals and deport them. I mean,
Yeah.
don't, 100 years ago. It's still it still is a problem. Yes, it is.
Unfortunately so.
So this documentary edition, it's fascinating. It's letters to and from Emma Goldman. It's newspaper articles. And then they're gathered together. UC Press published 2 volumes. Stanford University Press published the 3rd. And so I worked on that for a little while. And basically all I was doing was transcribing Emma Goldman's letters. So she had horrible handwriting, and we just had photocopies from the microfilms. So you're reading, and some of the letters I was transcribing she wrote in prison, so they were even more scrawling. And so it's I love doing that kind of transcription because you have to check it. Like, first you write it, and then you have to check it again, and then you have to like read it with another person to make sure that you're accurately transcribing it. Anyway, for a number of years, the Emma Goldman Papers Project would hire undergraduates, and you could, if you were interested in doing like being a research associate or doing undergraduate research, you could learn about doing this kind of documentary history. So I volunteered there for maybe 2 years or so, but also because it was like I first read Candace's or known of Candace's biography like in high school, so it was like exciting.
Right, yeah. And you mentioned kind of transcribing, and that's almost a separate element in itself versus like figuring out, researching how they came up with their work, how they developed their beliefs.
Absolutely.
And it's almost a historical aspect to it.
That's it was a history project. It was a public history project, and the people doing the footnotes and the sources were generally history majors and historians. And so I was coming at it, I think, more as like an English major, right? Like, I'm going to transcribe these archival documents, and then I'm going to check the transcriptions and then check them again. And so that was fun. And it did make me feel that literary history is what I like talking about and writing about. And you'll notice in the English department, we don't talk about history so much, right? And I don't want there to be that kind of schism. Like, I want to write about literary history.
Yeah, definitely confirm. I mean, it's a lot of that kind of close reading, that kind of analysis. There is, of course, like there are single author courses where we do go over like, the kind of the place the writer was in terms of where they were with their lives when they developed a certain work. But definitely that kind of the very specific process of, transcribing this person's works, their letters, whom they were corresponding with, that's still definitely missing.
The
from
larger
that kind of
social and cultural climate. Are they being oppressed? Are they facing censorship? Like, what is the larger, like, works of art do not exist in a vacuum, right? They are formed by social and political pressures, I think. I mean,
Right, yeah.
But sometimes if you're just doing a pure new critical reading of like a Keats poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, it's so formal and close reading based that you wouldn't know that, Keats was alive during, is it the Napoleonic Wars, right? Or like the political and cultural context can get divorced. I don't think that it's that way anymore, but when I was coming up as an English major and an English PhD, there were a lot of old school people that were kind of not here at Berkeley so much, but in other colleges and universities where people were really just into the text as text. And then you would go into post-structuralism and you'd read Derrida and Foucault and do all these amazing analytical feats with your language and the author's language. And I always kind of blanked out. I'm really a material person. I'm like, tell me about the author's life. And, when it came to Derridian constructs it was letters in the air for me.
Right. Actually, in another class on magical realism, we were reading Beauty Salon by Maria Beatin, and it was really emphasized how Beatin did not want to be writing about. He did not want people to look at this book and say, okay, this is a book about this epidemic. This is a book that could be about any epidemic. And who is excluded? Where does violence come from? And how did the people against whom violence is done, how did they deal with that? And he was really trying to have this text sort of be ageless. And that was his whole project. And he was rewriting this book numerous times to kind of avoid that sort of dating of this is when that book was. And I think there's I guess usefulness to both pursuits.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because you can imagine other authors writing about the HIV epidemic and the tragic loss of so many lives, and be very focused on this particular moment in time, because it was a particular moment in time. I was at NYU during the HIV epidemic. Like, you saw people, you saw the loss. You saw the loss. Someone that you saw working every day at the diner would then be gone. And then I moved to San Francisco, and I lived in the Castro, and it's such a loss that so many artistic, cultural, musical, like amazing, young creative people were lost to the HIV epidemic. So I totally take your point that someone might want to write about it and have these larger issues. But I also think there's just so much work still to be done about writing about the legacy of the losses,
Right.
And the people we lost and the work they might have done. Like, these people would have been, my age now, right? Like, sort of in the prime of their artistic and creative lives. And there's just so much beautiful work that has been undone. And it's actually interesting. There's a kind of a thread in English literary studies right now about unfinished projects, because it's actually through, I'm trying to remember who's doing it. Alex Beeston, I think, is the scholar. But if you look at films made by women in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of times there will be unfinished films, right? Because you didn't have the money, you didn't have the infrastructural support. And so thinking about what is unfinished is also a way of thinking about whose voices have been marginalized or not supported. Who ran out of money, who couldn't find a publisher or couldn't find a distributor for their independent film. So I'm really interested in stuff like that, where we're looking for those lost voices that aren't quite lost. Like, you can still find the fragments of those voices.
Right, and that kind of what they were intending to do. Yeah.
Or what they tried to, and maybe we don't know what they were intending to do. We don't need to know what they were intending to do, but there's something there. There's something in the archive. I mean, this is like the importance of doing archival research, is that you find the half-finished manuscript,
right,
the sketchbook, the notebook, stuff like that. I love authors' notebooks and sketchbooks. I love unfinished ideas.
Switching over from the more research-based work of yours to education-based, as I mentioned at the beginning of our little interview here, I had the pleasure of being in such a lovely cohort of individuals.
We had a great class.
Yeah, we did. We were able to talk about so many different things while you were mentioning to Misha about some of the ways that you talk about writing forms and expressing things. The first thing that comes into my mind was Kyle's first paper when we were talking about Parable of the Sower, when he's like, can I write this based on the video game Fallout New Vegas? And you were like, I love it.
Yes, because I don't know anything about video games, right? But this book, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, translates really well into a video game format. And it's Kyle who taught me that. And so now I use that as a prompt all the time, because loads of people who are undergraduates now do video games, right? Create narratives and scenarios with video games. Like, my whole attitude towards English 1B is, I'm the dummy. I'm too old to know what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I want to tap into, I want to learn basically from my students.
This is something that I, as your student, was able to just like, I could feel it coming from you. Like, it was like emanating off of you, like this desire to not just teach us about what we could do to improve and like give us different ways of understanding course materials, but the desire from you to just hear about our thoughts and learn more about the things and the ways that we engage in medium. Going back to Parable of the Sower, which I think might be a primary hot topic for this portion
for this year,
given the nature of the year. It is 2024. I remember when we were talking about the discussion of Parable of the Sower in class, when I told you that I was reading the book via audiobook, and it was so interesting when we would talk about things in class. And I think it got to the point where, spoilers for a book that came out about 30 years ago, which you should all totally read, when Lauren's home gets utterly destroyed and you're just reading about the massacre and like the death of the people that she's known for years, and what the different feels and vibes were when you read that on the page versus hearing that in my ear as I'm walking to class, just walking around casually and just hearing
Was it terrifying to hear it?
It was a little just unnerving because it's just a tone shift in the narrative, from one chapter to the next, essentially. And, we'd had that conversation in class about how, what's worse when it comes to visceral imagery, to be told what it is, or for your mind to imagine it. And for me, hearing it, my brain was going a million miles a minute of just painting a canvas of what this was like. And it engrossed me into the literature, mind you, but it was utterly terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a similar conversation if you're watching horror movies, is how do you handle visceral horror, and is it in the surface of the narrative, which I think most of the students agreed with Parable of the Sower, the gross out moments, there's, I think a dog is shot, there's some light cannibalism, but it's in the service of the narrative. And a lot of horror movies, the shock will be in the service of the narrative, but I can imagine there are horror movies that I'm too afraid to watch that are just for the gross out, for the, for people that are really into the visceral shock and horror. I can't watch the Saw movies. I couldn't even watch the Squid Games.
Really?
And the thing is Squid Games, there's a whole intellectual reading of the Squid Games, right? I think it's a Marxist reading. And I was I want to watch horror for its intellectual content, but I think my anxiety levels are too high anyway.
Right. Yeah. I love how we're getting just a bunch of different bouncing points. We're talking about audiobooks, we're talking about video games, we're talking about horror movies, and all of this is stemming from a class that was largely just about dystopian novels. Not to describe dystopian novels, I utterly adore them, but being your student and being able to see how much just this one topic was able to spread out into so many different genres that's right to our day-to-day lives. What inspired you to want to teach about dystopian novels? I know that you mentioned at the beginning of our course that it's something that you've taught pretty consistently ever since you got into the FPF program. What made you want to focus on the theme of dystopia?
Yeah, I think partly it's a pragmatic thing, because if you're teaching 1A, 1B in the FPF program, you're teaching non-majors. And so you need to find a topic that's going to engage people, and this could be their only English class they take in college. And I've had students also who reported, depending on your high school, you may have had a good English teacher in high school, or you might be like some students who are oh, I never read a whole book during high school. I just read, excerpts. And so there's a broad array of, perspectives and interest. And what I found is that pretty much everyone likes talking about dystopia and apocalypse and zombies. And so on one level, it was that sort of a broad topic that a lot of people are interested in. And then I try to, convert some of you into English majors, which I succeeded in with you, Alex.
I can confirm that she did. I was still on the, I think I might just stick with poli-sci track, but I really do like English, and I was you know what, I'm locked in. A little more personal lore for the audience. One of my closest friends, Alexis, was also shaped by this class to become an English major, and we still meet up with Professor Hollis at least once a semester for coffee, and it is lovely.
It is really lovely. You guys have done such a great job keeping up with me. I haven't kept up. I would be happy to go out for coffee with any of my former students, but particularly former students who are English majors or comp lit or rhetoric. And I did extend an offer to you, Alex, and also to Alexis, but I am willing to give brief feedback on literary papers you're writing for. So I'm just putting that out there in case I have other students, former students, that want to get in touch. But I think one thing we should talk about is Octavia Butler's novel, Parable of the Sower, because this year, so Parable of the Sower is an apocalyptic California novel written originally in the 1990s. It's the first book of a planned trilogy. Octavia Butler wrote the first book, Parable of the Sower, the second book, Parable of the Talents, and then she died before she could write the third book. And when Trump was in office the first time, and then there was a pandemic. There was a lot of press about this novel, Parable of the Sower, because it begins in the year 2024, and it features a U.S. president whose slogan is Make America Great Again. And it also talks about pandemics and societal breakdown, etc. So there was a lot of discussion around 2020 around how prescient Octavia Butler was. And what she says in interviews is that she just looked around the California of the 1990s and speculated where it might go once it was 2024. So for a long time, I would teach this novel and I'd be like, whoop, it's just around the bend, 2024. And, weirdly, this fall of 2024, I didn't teach this fall because I had I had to travel too much to be able to be in the classroom. And now I'm terrified of this novel because, Parable of the Talents, it's worse. There's deportations and incarcerations. But the thing I take hope from is that Octavia Butler never wrote the third volume. And the way I think about that is the third volume is ours to write. And so Octavia Butler is a Black science fiction writer, and there's a lot of great Black feminist science fiction out there. N.K. Jemisin is a great writer. Adrienne Maree Brown. Actually, Adrienne Maree Brown has a podcast on Parable of the Sower and has edited collections of science fiction a collection of science fiction writing, I think called Octavia's Brood. And so it's the idea that Octavia Butler is like a foremother for a whole new generation of science fiction writers, but specifically science fiction writers of color. And that's where the third volume will come from. And I think I did want to say, read more Black feminism. That's where our survival is going to come from. So read Adrienne Maree Brown, read Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Tressie McMillan Cottom. There's just so many great writers out there they're the people that I want to read if I'm thinking about how are we going to move forward in this dire dystopian U.S. that is no longer a fiction, but actually a reality.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the interesting topics that comes up about this, the nature of dystopia as well, is you've taught this class for quite a long time. I believe it's been about 20-ish years?
I've been teaching 1A, because I was a grad student here. I started teaching 1A, 1B in 1995. So this would have been my 29th year, maybe?
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. That's a lot of paper grading.
We weren't born yet.
No, you weren't born yet. My friends, you were not born yet. That's why I'm like, dudes, I'm so old. I need to know what the youth are thinking about. I've been teaching it for a long time. I didn't teach dystopia in the 90s, though. I only started teaching dystopia during the Obama presidency, and it was at that point it was like la 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 zombie apocalypse. Isn't that funny? And then as soon as the Trump presidency happened, suddenly I was like dystopia, and it became a lot more dire. And I started doing this exercise with Parable of the Sower where the lead character Lauren has a survival pack, and so she thinks for a couple of years before it happens, she's like, our walled community is going to come down. We're going to be, assaulted by these people on the outside, are going to steal everything. I mean, it's a dire social breakdown. And so she's like, I need a go pack. And in her go pack, in her earthquake kit, there's all the stuff you might need, dried fruit, nuts, safety pins, aspirin. And so I've started asking students to come up with a survival bag that doesn't just include things we need to survive physically, but also values. Because I think my real interest in teaching apocalyptic literature is the apocalypse doesn't mean the end. There's people always survive the apocalypse, right? And the whole exercise of writing or filming an apocalypse movie or book is that you do away with the old social order so you can build a new world upon the ashes of the old, right? So the phoenix, one of the earth seed verses in Parable of the Sower is like, a phoenix rises from the ashes. And so I think it's a really interesting exercise. If you as a fiction writer could craft a world, like a more socially just world, a kinder world, a world where everyone has access to food and fresh water and bread and love and roses, like what would that world look like? So I just think as a fictional enterprise, it's so exciting. Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my favorite science fiction writers, she really thought about that a lot as well. So anytime you're reading a dystopian novel, look out for the utopian elements in it. Like where are the seeds of the new world? And of course, in Parable of the Sower, the religion that Lauren comes up with is called Earthseed, right? So what are the seeds of a different way of living, a kinder, more socially just, more egalitarian? And where do we find? I find that in Octavia Butler. So I've really been committed to teaching Butler over the last few years once things got dire.
Yeah. In that vein, you mentioned that you've been teaching Octavia Butler for the past couple of years. I remember you mentioned to us back when we were students that your syllabus list changes pretty frequently depending on the nature of what's been happening. So I think it might just be fun to ask when exactly did Octavia Butler become part of the course? And what other novels or short stories have stuck with the course, swapped out, come back in?
That's great. You know what I want to say is the book I started teaching the year after Alex, you were in the class, is a memoir called Stay True by Zhou, who was a Berkeley undergraduate in the 90s. And so it's a memoir about being a Berkeley undergrad before cell phones. And I wasn't sure how it would play. It's a story about being a first-generation student. His parents are from Taiwan. So it's about that experience, but it's also about friendship and UC Berkeley. And then this is not a spoiler because you'd find it out if you read The Dust Jacket. His best friend, Ken, dies. He's in a carjacking and he's murdered in their junior year. And I remember when this happened, I was here, and you heard about this Berkeley undergrad who had been murdered, and there was this outpouring of grief. And the memoir, which I taught last year, the students really loved it. They were like, this is just like us, only without cell phones. And so it's about grief and memorializing a friend, but it's also about the importance of having stupid fun. There's stuff about whichever dorm Zhou and Ken are living in, and going up to the roof of your dorm and watching the sunset. And he's a huge music nerd, so there's all this stuff about Nirvana and Kurt Cobain in the 90s, but also a song by the Kinks called Waterloo Sunset. And if you listen to that song, and then there's all this rap in it, all this good stuff. And so the students did projects where they'd pull out a song and then they'd play us the video or the song, and then we'd sort of look at how it reflected on the text. But Waterloo Sunset is this beautiful, beautiful song, and it sort of encapsulates the beauty of undergraduate friendship. And so one of the assignments, I was like, just go do something fun and stupid with your friends tonight, because it's those kind of evanescent pleasures, like going to the donut shop. Like he talks about, there's a donut shop on College in Ashby that's been there forever. Right across, Alex, from where we had coffee.
Oh.
And a lot of writers have met there. There's a comic artist named Adrian Tomine. I hope I'm saying his name right. I think he used to meet at that donut shop. I think it's been a nerd favorite.
Is it the Dream Fluff Donuts?
It might be Dream Fluff Donuts. It'll be on Ashby.
My professor, I'm actually taking a seminar on Ursula K. Le Guin. Every once in a while, she brings donuts from Dream Fluff. So it's a name that just...
Yeah. Well, and Ursula K. Le Guin went to Berkeley High, and her father was...
Really?
Yeah, her father was... Albert, what's his name? He was the famous no, it wasn't Liquid. Kroeber.
Yeah.
He was the famous anthropology professor here, whose name has now been stripped from the Anthropology Museum because he brought in Ishi, an indigenous person who everyone in Ishi's group had died of smallpox and other sort of diseases. And so Kroeber brings Ishi into the Berkeley Art Museum or the Anthropology Museum and basically made him an exhibit and a display. And he died after 4 or 5 years of tuberculosis or smallpox. And so Ursula Le Guin is amazing. She writes a lot about the biased lens of anthropology. Well, we'll just keep going on tangents. This is pretty much an accurate representation of how life in my classroom goes.
But this is beautiful if you think about it, because, like I mentioned at the beginning, dystopia itself is such, when people hear about it, it's like this very negative and downtrodden thing where it's like, oh, why are you reading a book about the end of the world? What's the point of just talking about all the eventual bad things that are going to happen? But as we're pointing out with the way that we're talking about this, we started off talking about dystopian novels in Parable of the Sower, and now we're talking about, life in Berkeley, Ursula K. Le Guin, the very dark past of Ursula K. Le Guin's father. And all of this can stem from bringing on these narratives from this kind of literature and bring it into a lens where it's not necessarily supposed to be, oh, you have to look at everything from a theoretical perspective. It's just you're able to draw parallels in that you weren't able to see before.
And the point about dystopia is not about the end of the world. It's about surviving the end of the world. And how are we going to survive the end of the world? And what are the values that we want to keep in mind? And I do think friendship, empathy, compassion. I mean, Parable of the Sower, one of the questions is like, well, how do you trust strangers in an apocalyptic scenario? And there's this whole extended scene where Lauren's group runs into a family with a small child. They protect the child from wild dogs, and then the family gives the group some chocolate. And it's those kind of exchanges where you're like, I will give you something precious, and you do something for me, I do something for you, and now we've built trust, right? And so now we know that we've got a bond, we can trust one another. And so I think it's like that's how you start thinking beyond the apocalypse is, oh, in this new world order, we're going to I hate that phrase, I don't want to say that, but a better world would be one where we protect children from things that assault them, right? Whether that's lack of water, bad food, deportations, anything scary. We protect children. We're kind and compassionate to other people. And when we see people, and this is in Parable of the Sower, when you see someone suffering or in grief and mourning, maybe they don't want to talk about it, but maybe you just stand with them, And I think The Stay True by Washu is a lot about that too, because it's about a friend group who loses one of their friends in a violent death and how they grieve together as a group of Cal undergraduates. And I have to say, that's just an absolute stunning book to teach. And I think the kids in the class, the young folk in the class, the students, I think they really, really responded to it. And because you love Ken. He's your friend. You've been to the donut shop with him. Like,
Right.
You're on the roof of your dorm with him. What do you mean he's dead? And so then there's that grief. And then there's, well, how do you walk around with that grief? And the book itself is Washu's gesture of friendship. It's like, here, I made a book about you. You're no longer living, but here's the book I wrote about you and our friendship. That's what it's all about. It's surviving the end of the world through friendship.
Wow,
See?
that was beautiful. I'm tearing up here a little bit. Like,
Come to my pulpit.
yeah, and these are things that we even saw just in the classroom. I mean, one of my good friends, Kyle, was a stats major. He was not someone who would traditionally be in an English class. We had people who weren't sure whether they wanted to pursue STEM, history, whatever, and we were all able to just build this trust over, ironically, one of the first things that you ever told us, which was, well, you all passed the first paper, but y'all got B's. And that was it feels like a weird pivot to go through, but it's, very emotional. Now we're talking about getting B's in the class, but
And it was a tragedy.
Yeah, we all treated it like it was the end of the world.
It was the end of the world, but you all survived it.
Yes, we did. And we were able to grow, overcome, give more insightful, thoughtful pieces that were able to have our own spin on it. I still remember my essay on Parable of the Sower, very famously, called Call Her Daddy.
Yeah, oh, that's right. That was you.
That was me.
I think I dared you to use that as the title.
I built it with a long...
Wait, now that's a podcast. Isn't Call Her Daddy a podcast?
Yes, it is. Yeah. This happened in 2022. If the Call Her Daddy podcast ever decides to sue us, this was a paper I wrote. I can send it over your way if you'd like to read it. I'm very proud of it.
Maybe you can monetize that paper.
Perchance, you never know. In other news, we also had some stories that were in some ways very dystopian, but there were also utopian aspects in them. So one of the ones that we had noticed was Ted Chiang's Exhalation, which I think was one of the last stories that we ended up reading. I think it was around this time of year. Mm-hmm. And so Exhalation features a non-human protagonist discovering a crucial truth about the state of life in his world. And for those who don't know, to summarize, it's been a little while since I've read the book, but the air, I believe, that they use to breathe and live in their world is running out, and they realize that it's not an infinite resource and it's very finite, and it kind of throws everyone into chaos about the revelation of their own mortality. Mm-hmm. And coming off of reading books like Never Let Me Go or Parable of the Sower, which are very much in line with surviving the apocalypse, or like dealing with very dark themes of like human trafficking, or like actively taking stuff from individuals, in Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go's case, by literally taking their organs out, or in Parable of the Sower, where it's what people would call in the modern day the most liberal front in the country being torn to shreds in utter chaos. Exhalation feels very different.
It's a very calm story.
Yeah, there's no ending where everyone starts losing a breath and they all just start freezing in place and dying. It just ends with the knowledge that they themselves will one day pass. And is there a reason that you not only chose to teach about exhalation, but that you chose to put it towards the end of the class in particular?
Well, I think it still fits the theme of surviving, because at the end, the narrator, the non-human narrator, who seems to be made out of all sorts of metals and lenses, they accept their mortality, but they're engraving the story with a copper stylus, and they're engraving it on a sheet of copper. And the story ends with this address to the reader. So the narrator will be long dead by the time you read these words, but these words are still alive. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, Shakespeare's Sonnets 101, right? It's the idea that your mortal body will die. Everyone is going to die, but if you're Shakespeare or Octavia Butler or Toni Morrison, your words are going to live on, and that's something to be celebrated. So I think that's about surviving. It's write down your story now so that it's left behind in case anyone's interested. Maybe no one will ever find your story, but write it down because it's your story and it's important. And maybe the right people will eventually be like, oh my God, this is the story I've always wanted to read. So that's how I think of it. I didn't mean exhalation to be like, and so long, good night, it's the end of the semester and you're all mortal beings. It was more about the importance of writing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that made that so easily accessible to the class is part of the nature of the FPF program itself, which is that it's very seminar-based. Mm-hmm. Our class was about 18 students, if I remember correctly. Yep. And there was no GSI, there was no reader for the course. It was just you and us in the classroom. And I think that's one of the best parts of the FPF program. Misha and I are both alumni of it from the same year. And even in our other courses that we took, like the personability between a student and their professor is something that's actively lost on the main campus.
Absolutely, and I'd like to give a shout out to, for many years, our director and second in command, Tara and Francesca. Tara and Francesca led the FPF program while you were there, and I think had done so for about 10 years. They were amazing. They were so committed. They're not running it anymore. There's been some changes, but they were amazing. Their commitment to undergraduate education and advising was just unparalleled. They're really beautiful humans. And I miss them dreadfully if they ever listen to this. But yeah, I really believe in the goals of the FPF program, which is to have this kind of more community-oriented, capsule within the larger UC Berkeley experience. Like, I went to NYU. It's a giant urban campus, easy to get lost. That's actually nice. I like being in a giant urban campus where you can get lost and, but do think it really helps. I think anyone considering going to Cal should consider the FPF program. I think it's a great way to get started, knock off a bunch of requirements, and have these kinds of FaceTime, I guess, one-on-one time with professors.
So, having taught different courses, whether it be on dystopia or other sorts of R1As and R1Bs, what is it that, at the end of the day, attracted you towards teaching, and what is it that you love so much about it?
Well, Alex, it's you. No,
Aw.
it's all about you. No, it's about the students, and starting, to teach at Cal in the 90s as a grad student, I've seen generations of Cal undergrads, and I've seen shifts in the undergraduate population. And I'm just really committed to this university and these undergraduates. It's an honor to be in the classroom with you all. Like, this is high quality students. So that's what keeps me going. Grading, yeah, like that's like the not fun part of the job, right? Like, but the fun part is having these discussions. And I think the last thing I'd say is, if you don't go on to grad school, undergrad is your time to, I think, have one of the highest intellectual pleasures, which is being in a small room talking about literature. Like, that's my favorite thing in the world. So the fact that I get to keep doing it in the composition classroom is freaking rad, man.
And as your former student, I can also confirm that it was probably the most rad time I've had during undergrad, and it's just kept going up from there. And so with that, I would like to bring this podcast to a close. Professor Hollis, thank you so much for being here and speaking to us. I know your schedule has been very busy, but we appreciate the time you take out to come here. We appreciate all of your insight and knowledge you were able to provide us.
And I want to thank you, Alex and Misha, for bringing me here and for your work with the Berkeley Fiction Review and this new podcast series. I'm super stoked about it for you.
Thank you very much.
Berkeley Fiction Review is UC Berkeley's oldest undergraduate literary magazine. We look for innovative short fiction that plays with form and content, as well as traditionally constructed stories with fresh voices and original ideas. We invite submissions of previously unpublished short stories year-round and publish annually.